Hey, everybody. I'm really happy that we're here to chat about context and a bit about what we do here at Unblocked. This is obviously, it's fireside, but it's illegal for us to have a real fire in here. I apologize, but it would have been cool for the vibes. Yeah. But what I'm looking for is, just before we get going, just a quick introduction of like who you are and like what are you working on at Unblocked, so people get a sense of that. Do you want to go first, Peter?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Pete. I'm one of the founding engineers. We all are founding engineers here, by the way. So
this is going to sound the same for everybody.
That's going to sound redundant after a while. Primarily responsible for the AI pipeline. But I think another recurring theme is that we all just wear a lot of hats because that's what you do in a startup. So on to David.
Yeah, my name is David. I'm primarily focused on integration. So Jira, Confluence, Notion, the things that feed answering questions and that.
Yeah. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm Richie. Like Pete said, we wear a lot of hats. So I've kind of been involved with search, retrieval systems, and all the things that go along with, creating a SaaS company.
Amazing. What we'll start with is nice, easy one. What is context?
What is context?
We got to define this.
That's a pretty nebulous term, isn't it? People are throwing that word around in a lot of different ways. The way we think about it is it's all of the information you need to get a task done and none of the information that you don't. By that, we mean you want to be minimalist, you want to be accurate, but you also want to have the total context that you need. It's actually David that coined that term.
Yeah.
So I'm going to credit him with that, and maybe he can fill in other blanks that I've missed.
Context to me is everything you need to solve the problem. But I think to me, it's more important. More importantly, it's what's not in there, right? Yeah. We all have experience getting too much information and it can confuse even myself. And so I think about it in terms of when we're working with models, the less you add, the better. But just the necessary bits.
That makes a lot of sense. And was there anything in particular that you saw like going wrong when you were messing around with some AI tool and you're like, oh, deletion is just as important as inclusion?
If you include, documents that are relevant, I would see output from the models. And it would make a lot of sense because, I sort of try to empathize with the models. So sometimes I think, I would think the same way too. If I were given this piece of information, it's easier for me to think about things and focus on things if I don't have certain piece of information. I find models kind of exhibit the same behavior.
Yeah, it's a pretty good design philosophy when you're designing agentic systems to think about how you would approach a problem as an engineer. That's kind of like generally how we approach it. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's sometimes not optimal when we talk about context engines, but yeah.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, I know like from a personal standpoint, it's like, I want to get something done. I like look stuff up and I'll read something. I'm like, because like whatever, the header looks right. And then you read it and you're like, this is useless. So cast it aside. What are you thinking about context?
The problem that context solves is an information deficit problem. If you strip away everything that we've done together, take away all of the information retrieval and tools, what you're left with is a model that doesn't know anything about you, your team, your company, or what you're working on. And so the whole game is about adding enough context to be able to answer a specific question and layering on top of the base knowledge of models.
There's some solutions that people have tried to reach for to solve this problem. MCP is one. The deficit first of all, I'll explain how that solution might work. Then I'll explain what the deficit is. So the idea is that you take a bunch of these windows into different contexts. And so someone could provide an MCP server that's like for your GitHub repo. Yep. Another one is for your Confluence instance. Maybe there's an MCP server for Slack or something like that. And the way I like to conceptualize how agents work, Richie grounded that for us nicely, which was that if you strip everything back, it's basically just like, think of it as a software expert that's been trained to do a really good job with software engineering, but has none of the organizational context that it needs to go and solve your problems. So it's like taking a new employee that's an expert engineer, transplanting them in. For sure, they're going to be able to apply their knowledge, experience, and idioms to the things they're working on, but they're not going to know the past history. And so they're going to have to do some wayfinding first. So typically what would happen in that circumstance is they'd go searching for a piece of information. It might look correct. And then they'd go, great, I found what I need to get my work done. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to do my thing. But they may miss out on some of the nuances that are contained in other places, other contexts. And this is what we see with agents. They tend to search around and they stop as soon as they find the first piece of information that looks correct, and they base their implementation on that. A context engine is kind of like an omniscient eye that can see all the organization's context all at once. So going back to the idea of an experienced engineer that's just starting, now what you're doing is you're transporting them 20 years back or whatever the start of your organization was. And now they have all that institutional knowledge. So it's a huge power up essentially for the agents.
That agent serialization problem is essentially a constraint, right? So like they can't invoke the tool in parallel over all of the data set at once. So it's really a constraint on how much information you can gather in a fixed amount of time. And so if you had infinite time to retrieve lots and lots of information, then you could
spider around looking for it. And that's what these MCP agents do. If you give them infinite time, they will do that. And then you have to get into things like compaction. Because your context window gets like a gazillion lines long, and then you have to compact down and make sure the model's focusing on the right things. So if we strip that back and assume that, the model has an infinite context window, and you could jam every piece of organizational context in, now what you're left with is the problem that David highlighted, which is like, how does it know what to pay attention to? It could get distracted. It could focus on the wrong things. So a context engine is more than just like bringing organizational context to fruition in these environments. It's also about like picking the right things and focusing on the right things. And we'll get into some of the focus stuff, I'm sure, too.
Yeah. Well, I like what Richie was saying too, is like the idea of it being there's constraints. I feel like all of us in our work, that's like mostly what you're dealing with is constraints, whether it's like physics or something else in the real world. Developers don't like latency. So like when I think about that, like it's like when we were working on this system, or when you're thinking about it, like what is the tolerance there for like a human, let alone the machine, to like go gather context? Like what are we trying to do?
It kind of depends on the UX that you provide to them. So if you provide a chat interface, we're all accustomed to real-time chatting. Anything longer than 30 seconds is going to be kind of an upper limit, I think. There's other modalities where, if you want to do some deep research, you could set it off and run a task and, let me know when you're done. In that case, you've got a much broader constraint, a time constraint.
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense. Has anyone here messed with like, I've seen some people doing this, but they like loop Claude code so it can run for like 4 hours straight and just see what happens on the other side?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've heard the stories.
Okay.
Whenever I hear these stories, they sound a little bit more like marketing pitches than actual practical things. Because mostly when you hear those things, they're coming from the model providers.
Oh, right, yeah.
Like, we left this model running for 6 hours and it solved like some crazy problem.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm just always fascinated by it. I've never made one run that long, but I managed to get something going for 30 minutes. And when I came back, I like deleted the branch. Like, so like that was my experience. I was just like, I'm not doing that again.
I think I've seen that evolve in the right direction. And it's hard to pinpoint if it's core model capabilities that's improving this, or if it's the harness that is running the agent loops, or if it is the context. I'll just say I use a coding agent, as everyone does these, and I used to give it like pretty wide latitude on tasks, right? And I saw it thrash around a ton and make a lot of mistakes. And so I would have to get myself more involved. And I think maybe I learned some patterns about how to prompt the thing in such a way that it no longer does that. But the overall effect, and maybe the model's gotten better as well, is that I'm having to involve myself kind of less and less as long as the problem is very well described. And then I can let the context flow in through Unblocked's MCP server, and that kind of takes care of that problem.
Yeah. How have you, David, like actually with Unblocked playing, and maybe it's in our MCP, whatever, but how has that evolved how you work with these agent models, similar to what Peter was talking about?
I tend to shy away from letting it do its own thing. I like to see it do its work, right? I find if I let it just do one step at a time, I get to see what it's doing, how it's thinking, and then it actually helps me understand the code better, right? It's sort of teaching me as it goes along. And that's kind of how I like to use these tools. I want it to be able to learn while it actually does the job. So that, just for selfish reasons, I'm curious about how things work. But also, what if I need to fix it? What if I need to go dive into the code later on? If I understand how it works, and if I was taught by the agent along the way, then I could just go in and fix it.
That's because you have the skill set to sort of analyze and pay attention to and learn from what's happening. I am still a little bit concerned about the other side of this, which is that it's like allowing people to YOLO things that they don't understand.
Yeah.
And that's definitely a concern. What if you have an loop of agents? This is a training proposal that has been circled around, where you have one agent come up with a problem scenario and you have another agent try to solve it. And then you have another agent as a judge, and you kind of just loop this around and around and around and have the agents trained. So if you don't have, an expert sitting there watching what's happening, it regresses towards poor behavior. That same kind of thing that can happen even in the scenario of a context engine. Early on, we explored this possibility of taking the answers that Unblocked produced and using that as context into future answers. And like, what if it gets it wrong? Or like, it could just totally derail the answer. And so you need like someone to go in and then kind of label things and correct them. Now, ultimately, we decided just not to do that at all.
Right.
But you need some kind of correction mechanism if you're going to do that.
And one of the problems there was kind of the echo chamber effect, where if you get the answer and it's accepted by a user and they react to it, they thumb up or whatever, regardless of whether that answer is actually correct, it's going to get fed back into the system and lead to answering the same question the same way over and over time. So we figured that out pretty early on, that that's a pattern that's not always beneficial.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's actually hilarious. I want to how often does a user take an action that says this is correct, but it is incorrect? I guess it'd be impossible to answer.
Language models are experts at language. Everything that they say sounds plausible, has perfect grammar and spelling. So it's not often easy for someone who's inexperienced or unfamiliar with a domain to actually know the difference between whether it's right or wrong. And that's one of the reasons why we provide citations and references to the source material.
Yeah. That makes a ton of sense. Actually, yeah, maybe let's like hop into that for a second. Like, we build a context engine here at Unblocked. So like, what is a context engine and like how we think about it in order to do things like have proper citations?
Going back to the like, what is context thing?
Yeah.
All the things you need, none of the things you don't. A context engine provides like context, but in sort of more of a personal way. So it understands who the user is, what they care about, what they work on, understands the intent, understands organizational best practices, and the full corpus of everything that you plug into Unblocked. So, this like code adjacent systems like documentation, conversations that happen in Slack. This is the makeup of global organizational context. And then there's the context that's important to individuals. Like, this is the thing I work on. So therefore, when I ask a question like, how do I implement this component? That's a very vague phrase, but we know from what they're currently working on, like literally what they're touching in their code, what they've just been working on in their recent past, and who they are and what their associations with their team members.
Yeah.
Like how to bring that focus in the right way on the right context. Yeah. And then to do the sort of deconfliction process when there's conflicting information and tie that back, as Richie was saying, to citations of data to ground it in truth. So that's a bit of a long-winded explanation, but that's kind of the totality of the thing, I think. Yeah.
Do we feel like anything was missed?
No, I think Pete covered it all. I think I want to highlight the fact that I really want to emphasize the bit where it understands your view of the world, your view of organizational knowledge. So it becomes very powerful when the context engine understands who you are, what you have access to, and can answer based off of how it thinks you should answer. And that's very
powerful.
Tell me
more of that. Yeah, like access to?
So like access control. If you don't have access to certain projects or documents, it makes sense that you wouldn't know anything about that. And if you're solving a problem, maybe you shouldn't know about it. You don't need to know about it. And if we have that information about you, we can build that into the context engine to provide answers that are closer to what you would create.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, because this also just relates to broadly security in software. I assume it's like access of least privilege, like all these things. So like at Unblock, we have a notion of that built in.
That's right. Yeah. So we have that built in. And so we don't access documents you shouldn't have access to if you have that enabled. And one of the bonus features of that is it helps focus answers and reviews on that, on your view of the world. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Yeah. That sounds like it would have been pretty gnarly to build. Like how do you get that for like, because like, I mean, we connected multiple disparate data sources. People can feed data. Obviously, a context engine is more successful when it has all the things that it needs.
And each one of the integrations has a different, access model.
Oh man.
And like, there's no shortcuts here. You just simply have to do the work to pull in and reflect that access model. Some of those things are possible to do at connection time and sort of continuously update either through webhook calls or whatever.
Oh.
And sometimes you have to make real live API calls as you're dealing with a query.
Wow.
Yeah, it's wild.
That's like you're like checking at runtime.
Yep. For certain integrations, yeah, we'll take a look at the documents that we think you have access to, and we'll actually double check before we feed it into the model. It was like one last check to make sure that you have access to that. Not all integrations allow it, but to answer your question, there's no shortcut around it. You kind of have to understand each integration deeply, understand the access model, and then build that into your product. Design your product from the beginning with that in mind. I think that's really the hard part.
Yeah, we spent a ton of engineering effort on this. I mean, we ended up naming it Data Shield. That's kind of what it does. Some data sources have a relatively simple access control mechanism. For source code repos, for example, it's at the repo level. And so if you have access to the repo, you have access to all the files and issues and pull requests associated with that. If it's Jira, then it's actually fine-grained because you can add security policies to individual issues. It can be updated in real time. So at the time that we initially ingest the issue, the access control mechanism can change later on in the underlying source system. So that means we have to keep everything up to date. And that's a challenge, but through a combination of caching and very efficient sync mechanisms, we can make it work.
And it's not just the access to the individuals, it's access to Unblocked as well, which flows into data retention discussions.
Oh.
And so if a piece of data is no longer available to Unblocked, it's immediately revoked and removed, right? This is like enterprises that we've talked to. That's just one of the first things that comes up in every discussion. It's who has access to this data? What's your retention policy? It's table stakes.
For sure. I mean, I know we have a lot of acronyms that security companies have, like SOC 2, Type 2 antivirus, but it is wild to think that with Jira, for example, like it can change in real time. Like customer can make a change and that we're able to catch that update and act with that in confidence.
I guess there's two layers to this. One is access to the original source document through Unblocked. We don't allow users that don't have access to the original source document to generate content or answers from that original source document. But then if they do have access to that protected data source, then other users cannot see that answer. And we also ensure that that second level of generated content is also protected. So there's kind of multiple layers to this.
Because like that brings to a point for those listening, watching, you're able to ask Unblocked a question like a chat and it will answer you. And when you do that, you can have that be public. So anyone on your team can go see this thread essentially, but you can also ask privately. And then of course you can just talk with it in like your IDE or through an MCP or an agentic tool, which is cool too.
The history of that is actually kind of interesting.
Please.
We assumed initially that we're in our organization, we like to share things. So we assumed that everyone felt the same way.
Yeah.
And we initially started with public as default.
Yeah.
But what we discovered is that there's a social component to this, right?
Yeah.
When people ask questions, everyone feels probably like they have a little bit of imposter syndrome from time to time, some more than most. I'm just going to put myself in that bucket. And when you ask questions, you're kind of afraid that you're going to look stupid, basically in front of colleagues.
Fair.
And I think that social pressure played a big role into a sort of a suppression of Unblocked's usage when we first started. Then we got some of that feedback and we made private the default, and our usage numbers went like hockey stick,
crazy,
instantly. So, those types of little things, right? It's like little social learnings and stuff that you get building a product are the most insightful.
Yeah.
And so you really just have to put this stuff in the hand of users and see what they do, right? And be highly responsive to the way that they use the product.
Yeah. No, I'm laughing because like I would think certainly that you'd want it public as well, because like we have Git as a foundational source control mechanism. Like everyone can see what you did. They can see that you pushed, 6 commits to fix like whatever PR.
Yeah. No hiding.
Yeah, exactly. But I was like, but I guess no one sees your local, and I'm grateful no one can see what's on my local until I get commit.
I think there's also a kind of a persona aspect to this. I think that most individual contributors are just asking the question for their own benefit.
Right.
There's other type of people like managers who openly share information, want people to connect, want people to network, want people to be aware of everything that's going on. And when you talk to those people, they're like, oh yeah, I want to see all the questions. I want everyone to see this. I want to see trends for the data and stuff. You know, depending on which persona you anchor on, you get a different response. So yeah, we have a user preference to allow for that. So you can ask questions privately by default, or you can make them public, which is like more the kind of manager or networky type role.
And control the sort of technical nature of the answer to.
Yeah. And that's a preference that a user can set, or is it org or both?
No, it's a user preference.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So they can get like a more detailed response.
Exactly.
Sometimes I feel that we get these gotcha questions like, well, what if context becomes infinite? And we described that to your point, David. You're like, if you give me a bunch of information I don't need, like now I'm just confused. But like, how do we think that's going to impact these types of systems and like how engineers work as those context windows inflate and they are able to like use more of this? Like, how do we, for example, focus? How do we bring the attention of these models to bear on the thing that mattered? Because we've got the social graph we've discussed, but are there other techniques that we like spent time on to get there?
Well, if you want to get down to like, raw brass tacks, what you're doing when you're sending this stuff to the model is you're adjusting its attention weights, right? So you pass the context to the model, and whatever you pass is going to have some effect.
Yep.
If you want to drive focus, you just include the things that you think are really important. So that's the feeling that we get when we talk about super long context windows. By the way, the really long context window models are very good at finding needle in the haystack, right?
Yeah.
But that's when you know what you're looking for. So you can prompt a model like find the thing, and it will go and it will find it and it'll do a good job. But if you say, hey, can you solve this problem for me? Where it has to reason across multiple different pieces of data.
Yeah.
Sometimes that data is in entirely different shapes. It has different meanings. It breaks down because it's too much for the model. So then you have to start thinking about like, what if we had a world where we had infinite compute and infinite reasoning time and infinite windows? And you start to like you have to stretch your thinking pretty far in order to realize that, or you come to the realization that the optimal solution is just to solve the context problem up front. Because you're always going to have these problems as the context window gets longer.
Even if as context windows get larger and larger, like, I mean, you imagine you throw everything at it, and let's imagine one of those documents has nothing to do with what the problem you're trying to solve. Like if you just remove that one, you can. It means it's safe to assume that the model will do even slightly better without that one relevant document. So if you just keep pruning away, it'll get better and better, even with an infinite context window. That's what I believe. Yeah.
What if you have two conversations in Slack that literally disagree with each other?
Exactly.
What are you going to do? Be sad. I mean, you have to have some way of disentangling that.
And that's something that we've thought about too, is that conflict resolution. Yeah.
So like depending on the intent of the user and who they are and what the expertise is of the people involved in that conversation, we can kind of like figure out who the authority is on that topic, get rid of the information that's not relevant to the user's question.
Yeah.
And like zero in on exactly the right things that are. And from that, you distill down to the truthy information.
Very interesting. Yeah. It's a unique way to represent truth. Because like I'm just thinking about what Richie was saying earlier about someone getting an answer and going thumbs up, like this is good, but that human was wrong. Like it's just fascinating to think about how we have to operate across, I'm going to call them heuristics, but things that aren't really that objective. Because like truth we hope is objective, but in an organization that's not actually true.
You can get some level of objective truth, like source code, for example.
That's fair.
I mean, it represents the truth of the system, right?
Yes.
It could be the case that it's been not implemented correctly, but that's a different problem. If you assume that an organization's pull request review practices are good, everything that's landing in main is essentially the current truth state of the system. And so when you have other documents or even Slack conversations that might directly disagree with that information, you can effectively filter those things out or ask a judge to focus in on the right things. And again, it's all contextual. It depends on who the person is.
Yeah.
It depends on the question that they're asking, right?
Yeah.
If they're asking questions about cats and dogs, then you're immediately going to discount information about like flowers and pots. Like that, it's just not relevant. right? Unless the cats and the dogs are fighting in the flowers in the pots. Anyways, right?
It makes sense. Like figuring out how to focus, figuring out like it all comes back. It's almost as if we've come to a sense of what a primitive is for us, which is around the information you need and none of it that you don't. And everything is about shaving that. Like, because I also think that that has like a second order effect, because most of these tools operate better when you have less context going in the window. Again, I'm assuming because of focus, but I don't know if that's like fully been studied or researched yet.
Well, we've been talking about like the effect of minimization, which is really important. The other effect of a context engine that provides benefit is seeing information that, that going back to that analogy of a senior or a very experienced engineer that's new to an organization, they don't have line of sight to all the really important pieces of information. And this is what happens with coding agents. They rip and they go searching for stuff, but they don't have line of sight on what's the most useful. What they do is they execute their tools based on training data that tells them, hey, I've got a local file system. I can rip on this and do some discovery.
Yeah.
And that's part of training. But they don't have line of sight on like a really useful Slack conversation or a piece of the code. We have this internal component called the source mark engine. I don't want to go into too much detail into what the thing is, but I'll just summarize what it does. So it tracks changes in code through time.
Yeah.
And that enables all sorts of like really interesting use cases. But the example I want to point to is I asked a coding agent this morning, tell me how we track code changes through time. And because source mark is not like a very close sort of like related term to tracking changes through time, this coding agent just went off and like started to rip on file searches related to Git, stuff like that. And it just never found the answer. And the summary that it gave me was total rubbish. Like then I plugged in Unblocked MCP, which understood the semantics and all the conversations we've had around this thing and the documentation and so on. And the coding agent, it was miraculous because it immediately discovered what the thing was and then was able to take that and call Unblocked again with more questions about the information that it discovered. And then Unblocked was able to provide like even narrower subsets of information. Right. So that's just, that's something that a context engine can deliver that, without a context engine, it's just like not possible, at least the way that these things are currently conceptualized. There's a theoretical limit.
Yeah, of course. And like what's important here is that context engine, like, because we're a DevTools company, like we provide that at various points of the sort of software delivery lifecycle. Because like obviously that in your case, I'm assuming you're like in an IDE, like as you mentioned, the MCP.
Yeah.
It's like, but there's like code review, there's just the Q&A up front. Like there's all these places where I think we want that context to be brought in to a system in order to work, I guess, effectively.
Work as one of your experienced engineers. That's the promise of this thing. Otherwise, you're just an experienced engineer waiting in the dark and thrashing into walls and stuff as you find your way. So,
yeah, we're able to take into account, the users who's asking a question as well. So I guess it's kind of obvious if you're asking a question from a repo that you should focus on the code in that repo. But if you're asking a question and you're in an organization with hundreds of repos, and many of our clients have 400 or 500 repos, it's not always obvious when they ask, how does the API service work? What API service? Like there's like 50 of them. So what we do is we take into account the user and where they have been operating and who they work with. So we know based on our commit history and PR relationships and relationships with other people that you work on a subset of the repos. So they're most likely talking about the API service in these repos that they actually work on, as opposed to much more broadly in the organization. So there's nothing that they need to do to manually set that. They don't have to say, how does the API service work and look at these repos, not those ones.
Right.
It just works.
That's awesome.
There was an early, like a bunch of these systems had these early interaction modes where you had to like literally select all the sources of data that you wanted the thing to pay attention to. And like this just feels super unnatural. It's just like a really kind of, I hate to use this word, but like a kind of ugly way to interact with a tool, right? Where you have to turn all these knobs. And by the way, another thing that really just grinds my gears, I'm gonna
Let's go.
Let's go. Like, why have people gotten used to the idea that you select a list of models from a list of models? Okay. So like literally every tool Every code generation tool now has a list of like GPT 5.1.2, blah, 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 and like Claude. Which one should I use? I don't know. You know, what you're really doing there is you're selecting models because you've learned that certain models exhibit certain behaviors. And this is like through experimentation. As a developer, you discover which model works best for you. And it's usually oriented towards your style, your behavior, et cetera. So that's what we should be optimizing for as like tool providers or application providers, is understanding like the what that a developer wants, like the behaviors that they're after. Yeah, it's just really painful to see this evolve as an idiom. And, you know, I understand why it's evolved that way. It's because, and we can be sympathetic to or empathetic to that because we work on these systems. So we are concerned with model selection for sure. And when you think that way, it's hard not to separate yourself from that view and let that sort of selection process bleed into your product. Like everyone must think this is important. Yeah. But I think the philosophical viewpoint that we take on this is we will use the right model for the job, whatever that job is, and provide the best possible response. That's my view.
I agree, because when I think about this, it's like I love video games. I used to play a lot of live ops games. And when I consider live ops, like if something went down and you were like working with this system to fix it, and it was like, hold on, do you want to run Grok 421 or whatever? I mean, like, what are you doing? Like, just tell me the answer.
You're kind of just passing on the burden of choice to the user. So it's a UX kind of smell, I guess, is for a better one.
It's cognitive overload, or like passing the buck.
On that topic, if we pull that line, when people say things like, I like Claude for coding, why do you think that is? Is it just because, like, because I know there's a bunch of people like us at the forefront of these, I'll say LLMs, like foundation models, building like agentic tooling around it. So like that checks to me, like, you know, it's our job, like, you know, whatever GPT 5.2 came out and we all went and used it. There's a lot of other software engineers who are just trying to, you know, make the thing do the thing that it needs to happen.
So this is a little bit of speculation on my part, but partly grounded in a lot of the podcasts that I've seen of Boris from the Claude Code team, where they've really integrated the model training process with the importance of tool use and software engineering. So they're like kind of more well aligned in that sense, in the way that they train the model, right? It matters a lot to them. And they use Claude to do a lot of their internal engineering. Like it's kind of writing most of their code. I think Boris said something like 90%.
Right.
So my thinking there is that they're really dogfooding things in a way that is showing through in the product, which is how Claude has kind of raced ahead in its code capabilities specifically. Early on, what we saw was that GPT was generally better at reasoning across different document types. And I think we still see this today. So like long form documentation, that kind of thing. It's able to look at data sources from, you know, Confluence and Slack and code. And then it's able to reason across those things really well and tie concepts together. Like Claude always had this, the middle of the context window is lossy. And so the top and the bottom of the context window is where all the attention is. And so you lose attention in the middle. Point is that, you know, because of that, those types of things, Claude had a lot of trouble like connecting dots between different documents. I think that's less of a problem today, but they just chose to focus more on reasoning through code changes. And it's just miraculous at doing it. I'm theorizing. And, you know, I would love for like the GPT team and Boris to come in and go like, stop it. Like, you're wrong.
They're going to call you for sure. Is there a model that you prefer, like have messed with, or like why do you think this is? I think it's an expression of like just a vibe, but.
I mean, I think engineers are tinkerers at heart. They like to experiment and try different things. Do they have preferences? You know, we take the approach that we'll pick the right one for you, and maybe people don't like that. But yeah, I just think they're used to the models that they use, and maybe they have a preferences for them. Yeah.
Well, that checks out. Seeing the same thing, Richie?
People do have like model affinity. I think they have their favorites for certain tasks. There's definitely models that will be excellent at instruction following, if that's what you want. There's other models that are more creative or better at reasoning. And like Dave said, we picked the best model for the job.
We had an interesting experience with a customer recently that had some sort of objection to the way that Claude responded to long form answers.
Oh.
And he's like, I know that you guys are using Claude behind the scenes for this particular use case. And he turned out to be wrong, actually. We're using GPT for that thing. But what he was really driving at was that there was like a particular behavior that was objectionable. And so that should be the focus of that conversation.
Right.
It's like, why was it doing the thing that he didn't like?
Yeah.
And then, he created some sort of affinity in his mind that behavior is associated with Claude.
Oh, I see.
And it'd be interesting to know why that's the case.
Yeah. This is the whole like M dashes and emojis thing.
Yeah.
And like just a different place. It's like, please stop putting that in my pull request descriptions.
Yeah.
I don't need 26 check marks.
Yeah.
I wonder how much token that uses. Is that why?
The M dash?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hyper optimized token use.
Yeah, exactly. We're just trying to be efficient around here. This has been very fun for me. I don't know if there's any last burning like grinds your gears you want to get out, Pete, or otherwise, but
I think that's as much controversy as I'll generate from one podcast.
Yeah, the second season will be the real spicy takes. I got it. Thank you all very much.
Cheers, Brandon.
Of course.
Thank you.